It was the mid-1960s. Civil rights were the topic of the day. Some volunteers, mostly Northerners, headed south to answer the call to action. 4 of those volunteers are in our congregation. They taught at historically Black colleges and universities. Hardy and I, Hardy is next to me here, we'll share some thoughts, taught at Miles College in Birmingham, Alabama. Jim Lee at Moyne College in Memphis. And Bob Romer taught at Voorhees College in Denmark, South Carolina. And at an evening meeting in the future, we will have a longer session and Bob will share more extensively his experiences at Voorhees. Let us start with Hardy, who will focus on why young white civil rights workers went south. I will follow with a brief description of our experience, and Jim will discuss his experiences and lessons learned at Moyne College. Hardy?
So the question is, why would a pair of white newlyweds from privileged backgrounds in the suburbs of New Jersey go down to Birmingham, Alabama to teach at Miles College, a small, unaccredited, historically Black college? Birmingham in 1967 bore great notoriety as the city of Bull Connor, the director of public safety, and his use of high-pressure water hoses, snarling black attack dogs, flailing billy clubs to repress the lawful protests of Black citizens. This was the city nicknamed Birmingham, where 4 young Black girls were blown apart while attending Sunday school at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and the bombing of several homes of Black people. This was the city where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his letter from Birmingham jail in April 1963. Publication of this letter raised the awareness of many white Americans to the injustices forced upon Black people by segregation. During the early 1960s, I was aware of the burgeoning civil rights movement, but I didn't think much about it and did even less. I was one of Eisenhower's silent generation. After I graduated from college in 1961, I was casting about for something to do with my life and applied to a bunch of jobs, one of which was a brand new government program called the Peace Corps. I got in, and off I went to Nigeria in July 1962 to teach in a secondary school. And there I remained until December 1964. And my town was isolated up country, 2 hours of bad road to the next town. The faculty at the school was half a dozen expatriates left over from colonial times and 3 or 4 Nigerians. We didn't have television or telephones there, but we did have shortwave radios, BBC, Voice of America, Armed Forces Radio Network, and we subscribed to 2 magazines, Newsweek, The New Republic, Ramparts, Eye of Stones Weekly, which were all avidly attended to and discussed in the collegial atmosphere of the teacher's common room. It was here that I scrutinized the United States from the outside and became politicized, anti-war, and pro-civil rights. I got back to the United States on the day after Christmas 1964, and I was once again faced with that existential question of what to do with my life. My parents had moved from New Jersey, the New Jersey suburb where I had grown up, to Florida. There was nothing for me in New Jersey. And so I crashed in my parents' spare room and spent the winter in warm and sunny Florida I pieced together a series of minimum wage jobs at citrus packing plants, did some substitute teaching, and filled out applications to graduate schools. It was during this time that something important happened that I missed out on. During the winter of 1965, voter registration drives by Black people was underway across the South in the face of white resistance and great hostility. In Selma, Alabama, Martin Luther King was organizing a march to Montgomery, the state capital, to protest the attacks on Blacks and whites trying to register Black people to vote. 2 attempts to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge were violently turned back by state troopers. A 3rd march was announced. And to prevent recurrence of violence, President Lyndon Johnson sent in the National Guard. Thousands of sympathizers, white and Black, went to Selma to join the march. I watched all this from my parents' TV room, and I didn't go. I can remember thinking, why am I sitting here doing nothing? I could easily catch a Greyhound bus up to Alabama. It would only amount to a gesture, but it would at least be something. But I just sat there, and that has stuck in my craw ever since. To redirect my attention to a more positive future, I got into Columbia University and had the good sense to marry Jean Hazen and get a master's degree. New York City in the mid-1960s was in ferment. There were several civil rights groups, SNCC, Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panthers, and anti-war groups, SDS, Students for Democratic Society, the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, and the Committee of Returned Volunteers, in which I was involved, all Peace Corps people. This was the period when Malcolm X was assassinated, when Stokely Carmichael led the masses on a march down Fifth Avenue to the UN Plaza and harangued us with, "Hell no, we won't go" to Vietnam. And "No Viet Cong ever called me N-word." And Martin Luther King roused the roof of our cheers at the Riverside Church in his speech, "There comes a time when silence is betrayal." This was a prelude to the Columbia students' strike and their violent ejection from the administration offices by the police. How many of you remember "Up against the wall, mother effer"? During this 1967 spring of our discontent, the dean of Harvard College, John Monroe, caught our attention. He appeared on the front page of the New York Times for having resigned this lofty position at the nation's premier college to become the director of freshman studies at Miles College. And he was looking for a few teachers to join him in this venture. Jeanne and I wrote him a letter, and he replied, "Come on down."
And so we were on the road to Alabama. Just put this. Our apartment was small, rent only $50 a month. We lived right on campus with our fellow teachers. Most of our students were from Birmingham, Bessemer area. Hardy has explained some of the factors that brought us to the college, partly starry-eyed optimism, partly white liberal, maybe guilt-ridden do-goodism. But it was also John Monroe, that inspiring dean from Harvard that Hardy mentioned. He wanted to change the way kids were educated, teach them through relevant materials that mattered to resonate with them. And we were the vehicle to carry that out. It was exciting sitting in meetings, discussing heady issues of how people learn and how we could make a difference. The curriculum was multidisciplinary: English, social science, history, all basic subjects taught through literature by and for African Americans. Martin Luther King, Why We Can't Wait, was at the core, along with Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison, Before the Mayflower, Lerone Bennett, Go Tell It on the Mountain, James Baldwin, Black Like Me, John Howard Griffin, and Letters from a Birmingham Jail, Martin Luther King. The students read, wrote, discussed, debated, and the content of these books while learning their core subjects. All first-year students took the same curriculum, and I like to think that they found it stimulating and educational. Most of us were Northern whites, but there were several African Americans who came to join us in the experiment. A couple of incidents stand out in my mind. The student in my class who challenged me in an angry and pleading, sorrowful tone. Why do you come here pretending to help us, then leave us to our fates? That was gut-wrenching. I didn't have a good answer. And the march in downtown Birmingham on the anniversary of the death of the 4 little African-American girls in the church bombing. We joined a small group of mostly African-Americans with a large group of white bystanders, including police with nasty dogs, and I don't say that about many dogs, and probable FBI agents, trench coats, dark glasses, taking pictures and notes. I've often wondered if our records are still on file. At the time we were driving to a conference in Greensboro, North Carolina, and were forced off the road by men with guns and Confederate flags in the back window of their truck, probably because we had 2 fellow teachers, African Americans, in the car with us. And on the night, a group of us was having dinner at the college president's house, and a staff came in with the news that Martin Luther King had been shot. I could go on, but most important were the students we taught and left, not knowing their futures. Did we make a difference? Was it just a selfish indulgence for us, knowing we could leave at any time? Who learned more? We teachers, the students? We'll never know for sure. When our year was completed, we were off for a summer program in Ghana and then on to Indiana University for our PhDs. This experience was life-changing, but a blip on the screen of our 80 years. And now to Jim Lee for his experiences.
Well, I'm glad to see Bob Romer back with us. I'm sorry that he can't be talking today. Saying that I can't unmute myself. Can everybody hear me? Oh, okay. Bob, I'm glad you're back with us because this is a topic that Bob and I have talked about several times. And if you remember, Bob, you once told me that other people said to you when they knew that you were heading down to Voorhees, they asked you why you were going to the South to teach. In my case, when I accepted a position at Moyne College, and when I accepted the position, it was Moyne College. It later became Moyne Owen. So forgive me if I refer to it both ways throughout this talk. But when I accepted that position in the fall of 1967, I wasn't really going south. Actually, I was going somewhat north from New Orleans, where I had just finished an MFA in theatrical directing at Tulane University. But more importantly, I thought that I might be going home. I was born in Memphis. And in 1967, I still had family there. That Moyne Owen was a Black college was of little importance to me. After graduating from Duke University, which at the time was a segregated institution, as had been all the schools I attended throughout my youth, I too had joined the Peace Corps, and I too went to Nigeria. I spent a year in the northern region and then a year in the eastern region. During my year at the Teacher Training College in Uyo in the eastern region, I was the only white person referred to in that place and time as European. So I was the only European on the faculty for at least one semester. So I was often the only European in a faculty meeting, in a local elementary school where I went to see our students practice teach, and in an entire African village as I traveled around the rivers region of Nigeria with a local UN program. So how could a young Southerner, as I would have considered myself at the time, who spent his entire youth in segregated schools and neighborhoods, enlist in a program that would send him to Africa? I can't really answer that question, but in fact, I was quite excited to be going to Nigeria. Being in New Orleans in the mid to late 60s, I was also fully aware of the political and student unrest sweeping the country. But there was no way I could have been prepared for what happened in Memphis in the spring of 1968. April 4th, 1968 will be seared in my mind for the rest of my life. To this day, I am deeply saddened on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and I have the same trouble when I hear, as we will hear at the end of this service, the singing of We Shall Overcome. When I arrived at Lemoyne, one of my first appointments was with Dr. Hollis Price, the president of the school. When I arrived in his office, he was on the telephone, but he brought me into his office anyway. He was talking to someone at the Memphis Police Department. The evening before, 2 Lemoyne students had gone to a pool hall, and their presence in that white establishment had led to a public disturbance. However, the only people who were arrested had been the 2 black students from Lemoyne. When I entered Dr. Price's office, he was talking to someone in the Memphis police and trying to talk them into releasing the 2 Lemoyne students. To this day, I feel that Dr. Price deliberately invited me into his office so I could begin to understand the racial situation that I was entering. My MFA thesis at Tulane had been a production of A Streetcar Named Desire. As I was in New Orleans, what better than to direct a play about Southerners set in New Orleans? At Lemoyne, working with Black actors in plays that would be presented to Black audiences, I intended to select plays that would resonate with this audience. The first play I directed was Pearly Victorious by Ossie Davis, a play on which the musical Pearly is based. The leading parts are the more radical character Pearly and an Uncle Tom character named Gitlow. I cast as Gitlow the leading radical on campus. And he and the actor cast as Pearly came to me after the casting because they thought I had made a mistake, that I should have cast it the other way around. But I hadn't made a mistake. Casting the campus radical as Gitlow contributed to the humor of the play. The audience howled when they saw this character bowing and scraping in the presence of Old Captain, and then reacting totally differently when Old Captain turned his back. In the spring of 1968, I was directing Day of Absence by David Turner Ward. It is a story of a small southern town that awakes one morning to discover that all the Black inhabitants of the town have disappeared. Babies have to go without their nannies, housewives without their servants, and garbage is not being collected. But the twist to the play is that all the white characters are played by Black actors in whiteface, a complete reversal of the old minstrel show. It allows the actors to play all the known stereotypes of white people. There's only one white character in the play, a TV reporter who comes to this town to report on the situation. A feature of our set was a large projection screen, which we set up as a giant TV screen, on which we showed film of real conditions in Memphis, primarily garbage in the streets. That was the result of the real sanitation workers' strike in the city, and was also the reason that Martin Luther King Jr. came to Memphis. On March 28th, in coordination with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King Jr. led a march in support of the striking sanitation workers, and that march ended in a mini riot and total chaos. A group of radical activists on the fringe of the march began to break windows in stores along the parade route. As the police descended on the marchers, the leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference turned the march back and whisked King to safety. At that point, the mayor of Memphis declared an emergency and called in the National Guard. Due to the failure of this first march, the only one that King ever led that ended in violence, he resolved to come back to Memphis to lead a peaceful march in support of the striking sanitation workers. He arrived on Wednesday, April 3rd, and at a rally that evening, he delivered some of his most incredible lines. "We've got some difficult days ahead," he said, "but it doesn't matter to me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned with that now. I just want to do God's will." You can hear his deep voice as it sort of rings those lines, remembering that they were written down, reflecting that voice. But what insight into his own life might he have had at that point? Martin Luther King Jr. was shot at about 6:00 p.m. on Thursday, April 4th, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel as he was leaving for dinner. When I left home for play rehearsal that evening, I knew that he had been shot, but that was all that had been reported to that point. So as we plunged into rehearsal of Day of Absence in our cocoon of a theater in the student center of Moyne College, located on the south side of Memphis, we had little knowledge of what was happening outside us. Around 9 o'clock, the director of the student center came into the theater to tell us that he was closing the building. He told us that King had died and that there was trouble in the neighborhood. I remember offering to take home several members of the cast, but the director of the student center, he was a Black member of the Moyne faculty, didn't think that that was a good idea. He recommended that I take the young white actor with me, that we get into my car, roll up the windows, lock the doors, and drive south to get out of the Black section of Memphis as quickly as possible. He even recommended that I not stop for traffic lights or stop signs. Later, when I thanked him for this advice, he noted very lightheartedly, actually basically making a joke, that he wasn't really thinking of my safety. He was concerned that a mob might break into the student center and find him with me. Now, etched into my memory is the nightscape that we entered as we left the student center that night. There were gunshots in the distance and the glow from a fire in the housing development across the street. Sirens were audible throughout the area, as were shouting voices in the vicinity, but it was those random gunshots that I will always remember. So I got in my car, this young white student and me, and we drove out of the Black section of Memphis. And I don't remember encountering a single stop sign or traffic light. However, at this point, Memphis, Tennessee came to a total halt. A nighttime curfew was imposed on the city, so Memphis essentially just closed for a week. The National Guard was already in Memphis. They had been called out after the chaos of that first failed march. There were riots, demonstrations, chaos in other cities in the US, but not in Memphis. The city simply shut. In the white part of Memphis where I lived, nothing really happened. We were not supposed to go out at night, but no one really enforced that where I lived. Instead, we watched on television all the disturbances across the rest of the country. A fellow white member of the Moyne faculty, however, told me a different story. He lived in faculty housing near Moyne. Police patrolled his neighborhood after the curfew went into effect each evening, and helicopters with strong searchlights flew directly overhead. If he had owned a gun, he told me, he might have shot at one of those helicopters as it hovered just above his rooftop. And this situation was typical of what I often saw in the South in the 60s. Police force used to intimidate and control the Black community. The 1960s were a terrible time in American history, especially 1968. John Kennedy assassinated in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1968, and then Robert Kennedy in June of 1968. With the Kennedys, it was the loss of potentially outstanding political leaders. But with Martin Luther King Jr., it was the loss of a renowned moral leader, the stilled voice of someone who was trying to lead the country in a fair and just direction. And I think that my response to the death of Martin Luther King Jr. has grown over the years to that inhuman violence that happened in Memphis and its impact on the moral fiber of this country. We all remember where we were and what we first said when significant historical events occur. But do we really comprehend at the time the overwhelming impact those events will engender throughout history? Those thoughts arise in me often today, more so probably because I was in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, teaching at a black college approximately a mile from the Lorraine Motel.